There's a loaf of bread in your kitchen right now, and in every slice, there's more salt than you think. I'm not talking about something strange. I'm talking about the most ordinary bread in Australia, the one you eat every morning without a second thought. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how much of your whole day's salt goes into your body before 9 in the morning, and why it matters more than anyone has ever told you. I sat down and compared the nutrition panels on the supermarket loaves at Woolworths and Coles against the official limits from the Heart Foundation and Australia's own food labeling rules FSANZ. And this matters, because if you've got high blood pressure and close to half of Australians over 65 do every slice counts, by the end, you'll know how many is too many. We all know bread is about as plain and healthy as food gets. This very bag says so. No artificial colors or flavors, a health star rating, a good source of fiber. But that same bread is one of the biggest hidden sources of salt in your diet. And the law doesn't make them warn you on the front of the pack. Look at what this loaf promises you. White sandwich bread, source of fiber, no artificial colors or flavors, a little health rating with its stars in the corner. And down in the ingredients, iodized salt, which even sounds good, because your thyroid needs iodine. All of that is true. None of it is against the law. So when you put this loaf in your trolley every week, you've got no reason to be suspicious. But none of those promises on the front tell you the one thing that really matters for your blood pressure. That number isn't on the front, with the stars and the fiber. It's on the back, in small print, where almost nobody looks. So I turned the bag over. And what the back panel says doesn't match the promise on the front. Here it is. The back. The panel almost nobody reads. Find the line that says sodium, 380 milligrams for every 100 grams of bread. But 100 grams means nothing to you when you're having breakfast. So let's turn it into something real. 2 slices, 1 sandwich. 2 slices of this bread is 224 milligrams of sodium. That's more than 1/10 of all the salt you should have in an entire day. And that's the bread on its own. No butter. No Vegemite, no ham, no cheese, just the bread. Think about that for a second. You've been buying this same loaf for years, trusting it. And before you put a single thing on it, you've already spent part of your day's limit. But sodium is only half the story. Because when you read the full list of ingredients, something turns up that you don't expect. Wheat flour, water, yeast. So far, the bread of your childhood. But keep going. Wheat fiber, vinegar, iodized salt, canola oil, wheat gluten, soy flour. Emulsifiers, 472E and 481, vitamins. And something called a processing aid. Count them. 11. 12 ingredients to make a loaf of bread. How many do you actually need? 4. Flour, water, yeast, and salt. That's bread. Now, a long list doesn't mean a bad list. Let's be fair. Some of those things are there because Australian law requires them, like folic acid and thiamine. Others are there to make the bread softer, last longer on the shelf, or claim something nice on the front of the pack. So the right question isn't why so many. The question is, what does each one do and which of them should matter to you? That's what we're going to open up, one at a time. Starting with the 2 numbers more people have searched for online than almost any other, without ever understanding the answer, 472E and 481. 481, 472E, they sound like something from a lab, but you don't need to be scared of them, you need to understand them. Because once you know what they do, you'll understand why your bread is the way it is. Let's start with 481. It's called sodium stearoyl lactylate. It's an emulsifier. Its job? To keep the crumb soft and springy, and to stop it going hard for days. That's why this bread still looks fresh a week after you bought it. 472E does something similar. It strengthens the dough, so it can survive a machine that turns out thousands of loaves an hour. Without it, the dough would tear apart. That's what they're for. To make the bread soft, make it last, and survive the factory. So, and this is the important part, they're not there for you. They're there for the product. But here's the curious bit. See the vinegar on the list? Sounds about as natural as it gets something you've got in your own kitchen. Well, in bread, It isn't there for flavor. It's there to stop mold. It's a preservative. It's just that, because it's a natural ingredient, it doesn't carry a number that makes you suspicious. And that's the clever part of all this. Turn over almost any other loaf in the supermarket and you'll see this: preservative 282, calcium propionate. It does the very same job as the vinegar keeping mold away. But this loaf uses vinegar, so it looks cleaner on the label, even though it's doing exactly the same thing. Are these additives dangerous? According to FSANZ and the health authorities, in the amounts allowed, no. That needs to be said plainly and upfront. There is some recent research asking whether certain emulsifiers might affect the gut, but it's an open question. Nothing's been proven, so this isn't about fear. It's about knowing what you're eating and deciding for yourself. Now notice one detail. 481 has the word sodium in its name, but the amount is tiny. The sodium that really matters for your blood pressure doesn't come from the emulsifiers. It comes from the salt. And the question almost nobody asks is this: why does a bread that doesn't even taste salty have so much of it? The answer has very little to do with your tongue and a lot to do with how the bread is made. Here's the answer. The salt in bread isn't there, mostly, to make it taste salty. It's there to work. Look at what it does. Salt tightens the gluten, that stretchy web that gives bread its structure. Without salt, the dough goes loose, sticky, impossible to handle in a machine. And the yeast goes wild. It ferments too fast, the loaf puffs up all at once, and then it collapses. With the right amount of salt, everything stays under control. The dough holds, the yeast works at its own pace, the loaf rises evenly, browns nicely, and lasts more days on the shelf without spoiling. So for a factory turning out thousands of loaves an hour, salt isn't a luxury. It's what makes the machine run. That's why a bread that barely tastes salty actually carries somewhere between 1.5% and 2% of its flour weight in pure salt. And here's where it gets interesting. Because you can lower the salt. In fact, Woolworths they cut the salt in their white bread by about 1/4. Credit where it's due. But, and this is the but that matters in Australia, the targets for cutting salt were never compulsory. They were voluntary. And when the experts went back to check them, they found something uncomfortable. Nearly half the products already met the target the day it was set. Put plainly, the goal didn't push the industry to do better. It just put a stamp on what they were already doing. So salt is hard to remove, that's true, but the rules for cutting it were soft. Which leaves the most important question of all. If the law doesn't force them to lower the salt, what does the law force them to tell you? What does that label have to say, and what is it allowed to keep quiet about? Let's start with the good news, because we should be fair. Australian law FSANZ does protect you on one thing. It makes every loaf of bread show its sodium. Per serve, and per 100 grams. It's there. They can't hide it from you. But, and here's where the problem starts. The law doesn't say where, and no manufacturer is going to stamp high in salt on the pretty side of the pack. So the one number that really matters for your blood pressure lives where they knew almost nobody would look. On the back, in tiny print. And everything you do see on the front? The health stars, the source of fiber, the nice little badge. None of that is compulsory. They're voluntary schemes. The company puts them on if it suits them and leaves them off if it doesn't. And here's the detail that changes everything. Only about 1 loaf in 4 or 5 shows those stars. Guess which ones? The ones that score well. If a bread scores badly on salt, it simply doesn't show the stars, and that's perfectly legal. But wait, because there's more. Those stars, when they do appear, barely punish salt at all. So little that a loaf loaded with sodium can cover up that mark by adding a bit of fiber or protein and still wear 3 or 4 stars. The system's own official reviews have already said it. The penalty for salt is far too weak. And the last trick is the best of the lot. Imagine you see reduced salt on a loaf. Sounds safe, doesn't it? Well, reduced salt, by law, only means 1/4 less than another bread from the same brand. It doesn't mean the bread is low in salt. A loaf can drop from 400 milligrams to 300, call itself reduced salt with every right to, and still be well above what's recommended. And notice this. None of it breaks the law. That's the unsettling part. The number hidden on the back, the stars that are optional, the reduced salt that's still a lot of salt, all of it completely legal. Which leaves one last question. A single slice seems like such a small thing. So why did Australia's health experts start, of all things, with bread? The answer isn't in your kitchen. It's in the data of a whole country. Here's the answer. And it's not because bread is the saltiest food. It isn't. There are far saltier things than a slice of bread. Ham, cheese, a tin of soup. Gram for gram, bread doesn't beat them. But and here's the twist, you eat those now and then. Bread, you eat every single day, every morning, sometimes 3 times a day, without thinking. So, added up across a whole country, bread ends up being one of the biggest sources of salt in the entire Australian diet. Not because it's the saltiest, because it's the most constant. The drop that falls every day without you hearing it. Now, the fair question, does it actually matter? Does cutting the salt change anything? You don't have to take my word for it. There are decades of studies. And FSANZ's own scientific review puts it plainly. Lowering sodium lowers blood pressure in people with high blood pressure and in people without it. The lower you push the salt, the lower the pressure goes. It's a staircase. Let's be honest about the size of it. For one person, cutting the salt moves your blood pressure by just a few points. Modest. But spread across millions of people, those few points add up to far fewer heart attacks and strokes. And if you already have high blood pressure, you're exactly the person it helps the most. And what about that thing you've heard, that the salt scare is overblown? It needs saying, to be fair. One big study, called Pure, suggested that eating very, very little salt might carry risks too. But that was an observational study, with known flaws. The controlled trials, the ones that carry the most weight, all point the same way. For most people, and especially for older Australians with high blood pressure, less salt is better. So the science is clear, and the scale is national. But a country is an abstraction. You're not a country. You're a person, in your kitchen, with your toast, and maybe a tablet sitting next to it. And that's where all of this stops being a statistic and becomes yours. You've seen the picture across a whole country. Now let's do something more uncomfortable. Let's make it personal. If you're over 65, there's close to a 1 in 2 chance you've got high blood pressure. Among those over 75, almost half. It's not unusual. It's not your fault. It's simply the most common thing there is at your age. And that's exactly why what goes into your body each morning matters more to you than to almost anyone. Let's do the sums on your breakfast. Say you eat 3 or 4 slices a day. A bit of toast in the morning, a sandwich at lunch. Normal. That's between 400 and 500 milligrams of sodium. A fifth, sometimes a quarter, of everything you should have in a whole day. And you still haven't touched the ham, or the cheese, or the soup at dinner. Just the bread. But there's something almost nobody explains to you, and it's what really counts if you take tablets for your blood pressure. Think of it like this. Your medication is the brake. It's working to bring your pressure down. But a high-salt diet is like pressing the accelerator at the same time. Your body holds on to more water, the blood pushes harder, and your tablet has to fight against it. The medicine still works, but not as well as it could. And your heart and your kidneys end up doing twice the work. Now listen carefully, because this matters. This is not a reason to touch your medication. Never change or stop a tablet on your own. That's a decision only your doctor makes. What is in your hands, today, without asking anyone's permission, is the salt. Taking your foot off the accelerator. And that starts on the supermarket shelf. Because the good news, and there is some, is that you don't have to give up bread. You don't have to eat flavorless cardboard. You just have to know what to look for. And there's one single trick on the label that tells the bread that's good for you from the bread that isn't. Let me show you now. Here's the trick. Just one, and once you know it, you never forget it. Forget about per slice. Slices aren't all the same. Some thick, some thin, and that's why that figure fools you. Look at one column on the panel only, the one that says per 100 grams. That's the only one that compares like with like. And the rule is this simple. The lower, the better. Ordinary bread sits around 380, 400. You look for the lowest you can find. There are loaves, some sourdough, the odd rye that dropped down to 250. For your blood pressure, those are gold. And listen to this, because it really matters. You don't have to buy the dearest bread in the shop. The cheapest home brand loaf often carries less salt than the expensive one with the pretty label. You just have to turn it over and look at that number. Pick the lowest one, eat 2 or 3 slices a day instead of half a loaf, and don't pile the saltiest ham on top. That alone, that already changes things. And total control? You get that by baking your own bread. Flour, water, yeast, and as much salt as you decide. No preservatives, no emulsifiers. I won't pretend otherwise. It takes time, it takes a pair of hands, and it doesn't last as long. It's not for every day, and it's not for everyone. But a homemade loaf on the weekend, made just the way you like it, is the cleanest answer there is. And let me be clear, because it matters. This is information, not medical advice. Your body and your medicines are between you and your doctor. Talk to them before you change anything. And now that you can read a loaf of bread in 5 seconds, look at the rest of your trolley a little differently. The bread was the easy one. Because right beside it, in your own shopping, there's something you eat with that bread and it hides twice the salt on a label you've been reading wrong your whole life. We open that one next week. Subscribe, and you'll be among the first to know what's inside.